Hello everyone, my name is Leslie Dominguez and here's my presentation on Malathion. Malathion was originally developed in the 50s. It is a specific type of pesticide known as an insecticide, which its primary target are insects, such as mosquitoes, weevils, and any type of agricultural pest you could think of. And it's been used in several areas, including, as I mentioned, agricultural lands and fields, outdoor public areas, and personal use. And interesting enough, recently there was a major campaign, particularly done in the U.S., that was used in order to control the very aggressive mosquito that had recently come into the U.S. soil, and it had been known to be carrying West Nile virus and other viral diseases that we don't want to get for ourselves. And it's been used in several countries such as Russia, as I mentioned, the US, New Zealand, and Australia. And the way the chemical mechanism occurs in malathion is that it's a type of acetylcholinesterase inhibitor, which is a fancier term of saying that it basically blocks the receiving nerve cell, from its neurotransmitters, which then causes the neurotransmitters themselves to be breaking down, which then causes an overload and causes neurotoxicity and eventual death in its target. And as I mentioned, the target is usually some type of insect or pest. Interesting enough, the health hazard for malathion is not as wide and prevalent as other type of chemical pesticide as I expected it to be. Most of the studies were done in smaller mammalians, such as your rats and rabbits, and they did notice that there was a sensitivity when it comes to large exposures of malathion to expectant mothers and its offspring. And it did cause death in high doses in small animals, such as rats and rabbits. And as for the human symptoms when it comes to malathion exposure, they include breathing difficulty, chest tightness, nausea, cramping, diarrhea, vision blur, headaches, blackout, and muscle weakness. And interesting enough, there was a paper that came out in the 2000s trying to figure out if there is a potential cancer link with malathion exposure, high malathion exposure, or chronic malathion exposure to cancer. And there was a not so it wasn't really completely correlated whether if it causes non-Hodgkin's lymphoma with this constant chronic exposure to malathion. But it was an interesting paper enough because it did notice that there may be potential links, but the study size was too small, and it's something that should be visited in the future. As for the dose responses, for inhalation, for acute exposure to actually cause any type of symptoms, as I mentioned previously, it is at 0.2 milligrams per cubic meter, and for intermediate duration, it is 0.02 milligrams per cubic meter. And as for oral exposure, it is at 0.02 milligrams per kilograms per day for intermediate, and for chronic, it is 0.02 milligrams per kilogram per day. And interesting enough, they had done other studies to show type of dose responses, and in particular with small mammalian species. In this case, it was rats, and they did notice that there was some neonatal death occurred whenever the pregnant rats were exposed to malathion at 240 milligrams per kilogram per day. And there was some transgenerational effects, which meaning that male rats were constantly exposed to malathion at 300 milligrams per kilograms per day, had shown their sperm were being affected and did cause some type of potential transgenerational issues, such as when the rat impregnated the female rat, the eggs or the actual fetuses were not viable. As continue on with the PBPK model, they did notice that they did calculate that the dermal exposure would be 1.3 milligrams for adults and 0.4 milligrams for children, which is interesting because I know for some of the over-the-counter topical lice shampoo, the amount that they use is at 0.005 milligrams for that. So it's interesting how how the linkage of the calculations occur for dermal exposure. As for exposure assessment, this area was not as fruitful as I expected to be, but they did find some, depending on the size of the person, anywhere from 5.3, 21, or 85 milligrams per cubic meter did cause some upper respiratory discomfort, and there was some issues with a gastrointestinal tract when there was a large exposure. That there was a study indicated that happened when these farmers were exposed to a large amount of malathion during an explosion. However, there were some circumstantial effects that they couldn't really fully link with malathion exposure, and hematological effects. Same thing with the renal studies also. So for the risk characterization for malathion, generally the general population would not have immediate contact with malathion other than potentially and with their produce that they actually eat, because malathion is used to spray lots of different type of agricultural crops, including your tomatoes, broccoli, anything that you could think of that is grown in Central Valley in particular. Malathion probably has been used in order to treat it for pest control. Though the people who are most likely to have higher risk exposure are agricultural workers and the area around it and commercial farmers. And interesting enough, children who actually go outside and play and expose in a lot of dirt and field, there's an actual higher risk of them being exposed to malathion because the fact that this is used in a lot of pest controls in agriculture, not just agriculture, but also personal use for gardens and outdoor areas such as grasses and bush and shrubbery. And there is a link also to some exposure with waste plants facilities and higher malathion contact with the people who live near these waste plants. As for the risk management, there's been several local agencies, including a few in California, the EPA, USDA, and FDA, that has categorized malathion risks and has created a level of acceptable exposure. And the way that this malathion is actually tested is that there are several, particularly agricultural processing facilities, that either use their own in-house testing or they go through a third-party testing in order to get the malathion levels tested to see if it reaches a certain acceptable level before they're considered to be over risk, and they have to either retreat the samples to try to wash down the malathion or get rid of the malathion, or basically have to get rid of their whole crop or product, actually, in this case. And there's also education, particularly with the ag workers, and how malathion works and what kind of personal safety equipment that they have to use and what they should do if they're highly exposed, and such as safety goggles and safety gear that they use when they have to treat agricultural plants and crops. There's also a need for proper identification because, as with malathion is used commonly for pest control, there's also other type of pesticide that's also are used in combination to get rid of other type of pests that might be an issue with these ag crops. So there's also a chemical markers actually that have been developed for each type of pesticide, so it could be easily detected, as I mentioned, in either the primary facility testing or third-party outside testing in order to fall within the compliance of the local agency and federal government regulations. So in summary, it is a widely used pesticide, and there are several potential health issues that might come with the use of malathion, but a lot of the studies are still very not completed, just because there hasn't been a large amount of people within the study to really fully conclude the full effects of malathion. But since it is a pesticide, the people who are going to be mostly affected are those who are actually working in the lands in a very vulnerable population. So it is necessary for researchers and health coordinators to make sure that that malathion does not become an issue that then becomes a nationwide issue and that causes a lot of health health problems and the overall can affect later in the future. So this was my presentation. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.